Yo, word up the internet, Sita-pati Das here, your friend for another podcast, video podcast. Today I'm talking about constitutional issues. It's my thing at the moment. ISKCON's constitution is being formulated or discussed by a committee formulated by the GBC. And they're asking for submissions and discussion from members of ISKCON around the world. Thoughtful and experienced devotees they asked for to submit and to discuss the issues. They've posed 7 questions, which are very interesting ones. Now, the thing is that the constitution of ISKCON, it doesn't simply mean a piece of paper where, a few people write down their idea of what ISKCON is or should be. What the constitution of ISKCON means is, what is ISKCON? How is it constituted? To constitute something means to make something up, to put something together. So the constitution of ISKCON means, what is ISKCON and how is it constituted? And there are questions like, who is a member of ISKCON? How is membership defined? What are the elements of ISKCON? Temples, preaching centers, namahatas. What's the relationship between them? What context do they exist within? So the kind of questions that are being grappled with. Who are the personalities of influence within ISKCON? Temple presidents, formal authority roles, temple presidents, sannyasis, gurus, GBCs. How do they all interact? What is this thing? What is it becoming? And the reason why this is becoming an issue now is because ISKCON is evolving, it's growing, it's expanding. The kind of responses to this have taken 2 broad categories. One is, why do we need an ISKCON constitution? It already exists, and Srila Prabhupada's given the 7 purposes. ISKCON's purpose is already well understood and well defined. What's the need for such a thing as this? Well, I do see that there is a need for this because of, as I mentioned, ISKCON is growing and expanding and it's changing in its nature as it does that. You might think that these are kind of very esoteric, abstract kind of concepts and, not really something that you have to be concerned about. But for myself personally, in my involvement in ISKCON, these are very important issues that I grapple with every day, and that I'm interacting with people, and there are different ideas about what's the temple, what's the role of the temple, what's a preaching center, what the role of the preaching center is, what the relationship is, what the hierarchical organizational structure is around that. And different people have different ideas. And trying to sort through all these different concepts can be quite taxing at times, and it's also a very interesting exercise in the development of a community and a culture, because ultimately what we're aiming for here is the development or the re-establishment of a Vedic culture, which means a culture which is based on knowledge, Veda, knowledge of the self, knowledge of the Supreme, and knowledge of the relationship between the self and the Supreme, how to re-establish that relationship, and what it means to be established in that relationship. So we're working towards a Vedic culture here, and I'll just give you a little bit of a brief overview of the history of ISKCON. What we originally started out with was a situation where there was no Vedic culture, there was no knowledge, there was no Krishna consciousness in the West. And then Srila Prabhupada came and he established temples. He established centers of Vedic culture, Vedic knowledge, and activities based around a culture of knowledge of the self and the Supreme. So outside the temple there was no Krishna consciousness. So you had a very clear-cut, black and white situation. There's a temple with Krishna consciousness in it, and then there's everything else with no Krishna consciousness in it. So at that stage, ISKCON's identity was very clearly defined and clearly visible. ISKCON means the temple, and everything else is not ISKCON. So after some time, what happened was that people who lived in the temple, they got married, they moved out, they became grihastas, they started living around the temple. People outside the temple became interested in Krishna consciousness and began to practice in their own homes. So at that point, it sort of started to become a consciousness, an awareness started to grow that there's Krishna consciousness outside the temple. So how to kind of grapple with this, how to conceptualize it, what's the model that we use for understanding this. So then we developed the thinking of a congregation, and the idea of a temple being the center of Krishna consciousness, and then there being this congregation around it. So ISKCON became a temple plus a congregation. Now we have a situation where what was called the congregation, and notice that the term congregation kind of implies a particular relationship with the temple, that these people congregate around a temple, around the temple. Well, now we have a situation where in a lot of cases, there is more Krishna consciousness outside the temple than there is inside the temple. There are more people practicing Krishna consciousness. Sometimes we even have places where there is a higher standard of deity worship outside of the temple than there is inside it, because of lack of resources, lack of manpower, lack of capable leadership and management in the official ISKCON facility, that has become very debilitated in its own Krishna consciousness, and there's stronger Krishna consciousness outside of the official ISKCON temple. So what we see now is that we have what I refer to as a community. I believe the metaphor for understanding this is that it's a community, and that now in a lot of cases the temple exists within the context of a community, rather than there being a sort of a congregation which exists in the context of the temple. And this represents a broadening and an expansion of our cultural mission, because our mission is to establish centers and beachheads from which we can propagate Vedic culture. So we're going from what we might call a cult dynamic to the dynamics of a culture. And I'll make some diagrams to demonstrate this, and I'll put them on my website along with this podcast so you can check them out. So we're going to a community dynamic now where rather than the temple owning Krishna consciousness is out there. It's like the Matsya avatar, when Lord Matsya appeared as a tiny fish. He was King Satyarata was the name of the king. I can't remember at the moment, but the king, he found Matsya, he put him into a little pot, and Matsya the fish, the Lord in his incarnation of the fish, continued to grow bigger and bigger, so he took him out of the pot, put him into a bigger pot, then put him into a well, then put him into a small pond, then put him into a lake, and then put him into the ocean, and he continued to grow. So Krishna consciousness, this movement of Lord Chaitanya, it is an incarnation of the Lord. It's continuing to grow, and it's grown outside. It's gone bigger than the temple now. Now the temple is something which exists within the context of this growing community, this growing culture, and it is really becoming a culture, because we don't just have a community now with a temple in the context of the community, but we have a community of communities. So ISKCON has, the conception of ISKCON has now expanded from being just the temple to being a temple plus congregation to being a community with a temple within that community, to now being a community of communities, because there are communities of all kinds of Vaishnavas of all different descriptions, walks of life, different communities congregating in different ways, geographically, by age group, the Kuli Mela. You have communities of Vaishnavas accumulating around their gender identities. So you have the lesbian, gay, bi, and transgender Vaishnavas, Galva. So there are communities within communities of persons practicing Krishna consciousness. So ISKCON has gone from being a small, the identity of ISKCON has gone from being this very narrow definition to being something much broader than that. It's becoming more of a culture, and I believe that its constitution is federal. It's a federal constitution now. It's made up of many different things within that. So now the question has become, how do we grapple with this? How do we understand it in a nice way? Because a lot of the kind of old models that you had of Krishna consciousness equals ISKCON equals the temple, that doesn't work anymore. And a lot of dilemmas are coming out of that paradigm. One of them is another committee that they've constituted to look at the question of what happens when you have more than one ISKCON center in a city. Now, let's take Brisbane, for example. We have 1.6 million people here. There is no one center that can service 1.6 million people. We need, in every town and village, we need a center